In this video, I will be performing the suite in D minor by Nathan Mondry. Nathan is an organist, harpsichordist, and fortepianist. In addition to composing, he is known for his imaginative improvisations, and he is also a member of the Baroque ensemble Les Barocudas. I will put a link to the ensemble's YouTube channel in the video description. The suite in D minor was written between 2018 and 2019 and has the following four movements: Allemande, Courante, Sarabande, and Gigue. It is included in Nathan's collection of keyboard compositions entitled The Well-Traveled Clavierist, but is also available on IMSLP. Since this suite is a newly composed work, it raises a different set of issues compared to the 17th and 18th century repertory I usually play. The first issue I would like to address is the musical style. It would be very easy to generalize and say that this suite is written in the Baroque style. However, I don't think such a description really captures the complexity of what is going on. Oftentimes, when we say that a contemporary work is written in the style of a previous era, there is the implication the composer is either inspired by or imitating a particular past musical style. This is indeed the case, especially with such compositions that were written during most of the 20th century, because for the most part, composers who looked back to the past were generally not really versed in the performance practice of previous eras, so that what we really have are 20th century compositions inspired by certain aspects of the sound or the formal elements of the music of previous eras, which, while they may have moments that strongly allude to past musical styles, they could never be mistaken for actual Baroque or classical compositions. Sometimes terms such as neoclassical or neo-Baroque are used to describe at least some of these works, but these terms can certainly not encompass the very wide range of approaches and compositions that take their cue from past musical styles. Just to offer a few examples, music inspired by the past would include Igor Stravinsky's many neoclassical compositions, which in themselves offer a wide variety of approaches, Hugo Distler's Harpsichord Concerto, Ferruccio Busoni's Fantasia Contrapuntistica, which is an homage to Bach's Art of Fugue, the modern jazz quartet's Bach-inspired compositions, including Vendôme, with its references to fugal writing, the song Piggies from the Beatles' White Album, and the fugue in Emerson, Lake and Palmer's album Trilogy. With the advent of historically informed performance, there are now musicians who are intimately familiar with the performing conventions and the musical language of Baroque music. And when a historically informed performer also composes music in the Baroque style, the results can be fundamentally different from the examples I mentioned above. If I were to describe Nathan's suite in terms of style, I'd say that the elements of the Baroque language have been so thoroughly assimilated that we're dealing with a piece that could be mistaken for a real 18th century composition, especially since it does not allude to a particular composer, but instead creates its own original and individual musical identity. This brings up the second issue, which concerns how to read the score. Normally, when we're dealing with scores of 20th and 21st century music, we tend to interpret the score fairly literally because composers will usually furnish the score with detailed performance indications regarding different aspects of interpretation, like articulation, dynamics, tempo, etc. The score of Nathan Mondry's D minor suite, however, is notated very much like a Baroque score, which is meant to be read very differently compared to a modern score. From our modern perspective, Baroque scores tend to appear very sparse since they predominantly contain only the actual notes and the rhythmic values, and not much else in terms of other performing indications like phrasing or dynamics. In his book, The End of Early Music, Bruce Haynes offers an apt explanation for the reasons behind this apparent lack of performance indications in Baroque scores. Quote, "Baroque notation is like shorthand, a quality known in the trade as thin writing. Baroque composers rarely included marks to indicate phrasing gestures, for instance, or dynamics, note shaping, flexibility of tempo, and subtlety of rhythm. Variables of that kind are implied in the playing style, however, so performers supplied them as a matter of course. Thin writing was not thin because thick writing hadn't been invented yet. It was deliberate. It accommodated spontaneous input from the performers." End quote. We find echoes of Haynes's description in The Well-Traveled Clavierist, where Nathan Mondry explicitly suggests that the performer should not interpret the score literally. In a note near the end of the book, we read that, quote, "More ornaments and ties can be added than indicated. Inégalité is more or less permissible depending on the piece and one's taste, and I will not spoil the fun of unraveling all these mysteries." End quote. This, of course, makes perfect sense. A piece that is almost indistinguishable from an 18th century composition is to be performed following the conventions of the 18th century. Here, though, is where I have a slight, shall we say, difficulty in forgetting that this is a contemporary piece. At the heart of the matter lies a concept commonly referred to as composer's intent. Now, I realize that there are numerous debates regarding this concept and its validity, so I want to make clear that what I'm about to say should not be construed either as a defense or as a criticism of the concept. Rather, this is simply my own aesthetic position, my personal interaction, if you will, with the music I perform. A basic premise of my approach is to try and understand as much as possible the performing conventions and performing language the composer would have been familiar with. The reason I do this is not because I harbor any illusions of being able to know exactly what the composer wanted. The idea is rather to initiate a dialogue, if you will, with the composer and their work in order to discover the music's expressive content so that I can bring out or illuminate that expressive content in my performance. This dialogue between composer and performer gets a little more complex when we're dealing with Baroque repertory, since what Bruce Haynes identified as the thin writing of the score means that performers are expected to add a lot of the missing performing details, many of which can be crucial to the expressive content of the piece. Here, our understanding of the musical conventions and language of the time must be supplemented with a great deal of creativity and imagination if we're going to bring this music to life. Since so much creative input from the performer is required, I oftentimes wonder what Baroque composers would think of my performances of their music, but of course, none of them are here to listen to what I do. This is definitely not the case with Nathan, who is very much here and can listen to my performance of his suite. Not only that, but his own performance of the Courante from the suite is available on YouTube, and I will put a link in the video description. I do not mean to imply that this hindered my performance of the suite, or that I hesitated in adding extra details. As you will notice when you follow the recording with a score, I treat the suite exactly as if it were an 18th century composition, and also added various degrees of inégalité in the first three movements. As for Nathan's own performance of the Courante, I made a point of not listening to it, but will do so right after I post this video, when it will be too late to change anything. However, the thought in the back of my mind of what a composer would think about my performance is certainly more persistent when the composer happens to be alive, and especially when I'm supposed to treat the score with a generous amount of creative freedom. Finally, I would like to address how I went about recording the Gigue. I have mentioned before that due to an issue I have with my hands, there are certain stretches I need to avoid, which means there are certain pieces I can't, or better said, shouldn't really play, or if I try to play them, I would have to negotiate some of those stretches in some creative way. Unfortunately, this Gigue has a few too many stretches that my hands don't particularly like. I should stress here that this has nothing to do with the way the piece is written, because it is conceived very idiomatically for the harpsichord, just like the rest of the suite. The issue has to do purely with my hands. At the same time, I thought it would be a pity not to be able to record and thus present the entire suite. So in the end, I decided to use the same technique I had resorted to back in May, when I recorded Otto Steinmeyer's piece Le Plaisir de Cétacé, which was to overdub myself. Before I explain exactly how I did that, let me briefly mention that the Gigue has a primarily three-voice polyphonic texture with a main subject that is imitated in all three voices in the manner of a fugue. The idea was to first record two voices distributed between both hands, or in some passages just one voice, and then record the remaining one or two voices while playing back the first recording and listening to it through headphones. Then I synchronized both recordings using Audacity and then mixed them so that both recordings are distributed between both channels. In other words, you don't hear one recording exclusively on the left channel and the other on the right channel. Both recordings occupy both channels. I have to admit that the overdubbing process was very tricky to do properly, especially because rhythmic values in Baroque music are not meant to be interpreted literally. What I mean by this is that everything depends not only on the position of the particular note within the meter, but also on how we want to interpret the short musical gestures that make up the musical discourse. Because in order to give each individual gesture its own identity, we have to interpret rhythmic values in a flexible way. What this really means, however, is that during a performance, there is a constant interaction, a constant give and take between the various melodic strands of the musical texture that can only convincingly occur in real time, as a slight bending of the rhythm in one voice will require some sort of compensation or response in another voice. Add to that the fact that I don't plan out in advance exactly how I will interpret every musical gesture, since I believe that a performance should have an element of spontaneity. And you can imagine that trying to overdub myself without being a little out of sync in a couple of places is pretty much impossible. Of course, I could have tried to follow a much stricter rhythm, but doing so would have robbed the piece of its expressive power, and that would have been even less desirable. I simply hope that you will find the performance compelling enough to appreciate how wonderful this piece is, and if you play the harpsichord, that you will want to play the piece yourself, along with the rest of the movements, of course. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the performance.